over 2,000 nuclear tests had taken place, up to one a week at the peak of testing. Indonesia hosts and operates 6 of our international monitoring system stations, so important for the verification, because nuclear explosive tests are critical to developing nuclear weapons.
What brings you to Indonesia?
Indonesia is one of our wonderful state signatories to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, one of 187 countries around the world. A country that's really strongly committed to non-proliferation and disarmament. And in the case of our treaty, Indonesia hosts and operates 6 of our international monitoring system stations, so important for the verification of a ban on nuclear testing.
So you mentioned about 6 Indonesian facilities. Has one of the facilities monitor the tests?
Well, all 6 of them operate all of the time. They are seismic stations, so they're detecting underground tests. And so they're picking up vibrations in the Earth's crust, which would come from a nuclear explosion. They pick up seismic activity of earthquakes as well. And even mining explosions and other civil activities. But we can analyze that data and determine if that's a signal which is coming from a nuclear explosion as opposed to any other source. We greatly value those 6 stations that are scattered across the Indonesian archipelago, as that they give visibility, as it were, in the seismic world of any potential test, in this broader region, and they make a very valuable contribution.
You mentioned about the treaty, but the treaty yet to come into force. What are your efforts to make it under other party to ratify the treaty?
With the possibility of 196 countries they could join the treaty, we have 187. So it's almost universal support. And of the other 9 that have not yet ratified the treaty, there's probably only 1 that doesn't agree with the object and purpose of the treaty. So it enjoys such strong support. But for it to become legally binding, there is a group of 44 countries of which every one of them has to ratify for the treaty to enter into force. And we're engaging and reaching out to each of those and working with their particular circumstances to see how they could take those next steps forward.
So you mentioned many times about the monitoring system. What are the progress to enhance the number of certificate monitoring system?
The location and the type of stations are defined in the treaty and treaty-associated documents. And that's where it was decided by the technical experts of the world back in the 1990s that Indonesia would host 6 seismic stations as a part of our global network. It's BMKG's responsibility to operate those stations, and we are delighted with the wonderful and professional way that they do that, and how in this way Indonesia is contributing to this global need. 307 of the ultimately 337 facilities and stations around the world have been established. So over 90% is there. The system works. It detected every one of the North Korean nuclear tests. In fact, the whole treaty works because the treaty was open for signature almost 30 years ago on the 24th of September of 1996. Before that date, over 2,000 nuclear tests had taken place, up to one a week at the peak of testing. But from that date in September of 1996 through to today, 30 years on, less than a dozen tests have taken place. So the tap has almost been turned off when it comes to nuclear testing. We would love to see 100% of the facilities established, but even with over 90%, it detects across the whole planet and gives confidence to all states that we know if testing is taking place.
Since you visit Indonesia, how can Indonesia and other non-nuclear states support your work and the verification system of to strengthen global norm against nuclear testing?
So the important issue is to see that no state conducts a nuclear explosive test, because nuclear explosive tests are critical to developing nuclear weapons. So if a state doesn't have nuclear weapons, they need to test. If a state wants to develop more and different kinds of weapons, they also almost always need to test. So if you don't allow testing, if you have an effective ban on testing, then that is good for all mankind and for all states. So what we need is all states, regardless of whether they possess nuclear weapons or not, to be upholding this moratorium on testing. Indonesia has never tested and has no intention of doing so, and we greatly appreciate that. But we also want those states to use their voice, to speak loudly and clearly for a world where there is not a spread, a proliferation of nuclear weapons, for a world where there is actually no further nuclear testing. And particularly for a state like Indonesia, a non-nuclear weapon state, you host 6 of our over 300 monitoring system stations. And that actually gathers information from all around the world that could detect if a nuclear explosion occurred anywhere, anytime. So it's all good and well for states to say, we're not testing, but can we verify that that is true? The international monitoring system can verify that from a small nuclear explosion of 500 tons of TNT equivalent up to infinity. And across that range, anywhere on this planet, the international monitoring system can detect a nuclear explosion.
Despite there is several nuclear states in our region in Indo-Pacific. Most of our nation in Indo-Pacific quite object to nuclear weapon development and moreover nuclear weapon tests. So what is your organization do to support the nuclear weapon-free zone in this area?
Clearly in the Southeast Asian region you have the Southeast Asian Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. That treaty bans certain activities within this region and declares it as a nuclear-free zone. So it gives confidence to all of those states that the commitments made by their fellow regional members are all being upheld. And it's about building confidence globally. Regionally, yes, but then ultimately globally.
This is a very challenging time for the nuclear. How does your organization and the treaty verification to restrain the use of nuclear weapon in any other active war field?
But the reason that the treaty is so effective is that for any explosion above 500 tons of TNT, it will be detected. And so any state developing a nuclear weapon, and a nuclear weapon will be greater than 500 tons of TNT, it will be detected and they know that. So they can't test under the cover of darkness, so to speak. It will be in the bright light of day. One of our challenges is to build greater confidence between 0 yield and 500 tons of TNT. And that is something that we're working with states on, is to look at how we make that low yield testing even more evident, if there was ever to have those sorts of tests taking place.